Morning. It's good to see everybody this morning. It's a special day here, and we welcome all our visitors. We hope that you'll find this to be an encouraging place, and if you have any questions, we welcome them and hope that we get a chance to get to know you a little bit better this morning. Tonight is a special occasion. At 5 o'clock, we will be hosting the area-wide youth devotional, and we have Andrew Kingsley who will be with us. And many of you remember him when he served here as a youth minister. He's now the preacher at the University Church in Montgomery, doing very well down there, doing a great job. And I'm looking forward to seeing him and renewing our acquaintance and having him here, and all our guests that'll be here. If you want to hear some really good singing, come tonight at 5 o'clock for the area-wide. We are really looking forward to that. This morning our lesson is entitled, His Truth, My Truth. And we're looking at John chapter 7. The background of this text is the Jewish Feast of Booths. The Feast of Booths was one of the three major feasts held in Jerusalem every year. It commemorated the wilderness wandering, and one of the rituals that reflected back on that time when Moses led the Israelites through the wilderness is that they would build temporary dwelling places out of branches, tree branches and limbs, and live in them for 7 days. On the 8th day, there was a great celebration. Other rituals were added through the years up into the time of Jesus. There was a water ritual around the pool of Siloam. There was a light festival that was also involved, and these are reflected in John chapters 7 and 8. For example, in chapter 7, Jesus promises the one who believes that would spring forth out of him living water. Well, that had to do with that water ritual at the pool of Siloam. And in chapter 8, verse 12, one of the I am statements of Jesus is, I am the light of the world. You can imagine during that light ceremony that was part of the Feast of Booths, part of that week-long celebration, people reflecting on Jesus being the light as they are celebrating that feast. There are two basic purposes of the feast, though. And these are ones that we need to draw our attention to. The first is, it emphasized dependence on the Lord. During the wilderness wanderings, the Israelites were totally dependent on God. He sent manna and quail from heaven to feed them. He led them with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Without Him, they would have died immediately. But He led them through that and brought them to the promised land. Total dependence on God. And also, the other purpose of the feast was to express gratitude for the harvest. It always occurred during the months of September, October on our calendar, at the end of the harvest when everything was brought in and there was time for celebrating that God once again provided through their crops for their families. And so Jesus' words on this occasion go together with those two emphases during the Feast of Booths, the expression of complete dependence on God and gratitude for His bountiful blessings. You know, many people reject Christianity because of the rules. They don't like to be confined. They feel Christianity is very restrictive, and they ask questions like, why would I want to give someone else control over my life? Or why do Christians have so many rules? Or why is the church getting involved in my personal business? Those are questions you hear a lot of people ask today, and you understand where they're coming from. But what if the Christian faith wasn't just about the rules? What if it's more about living according to truth? And truth is not some arbitrary law passed by Congress in heaven, but truth is a person. Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. John chapter 14, verse 6. He told Pilate when he was being questioned that his purpose for coming to the world was to bear witness to the truth. And in the text, with the backdrop of the Festival of Booths, Jesus says in John chapter 7, verse 18, the one who seeks the glory of Him who sent Him is true, and in Him there is no falsehood. So at this feast where dependence and gratitude is being highlighted, Jesus recalibrates truth not as a list of rules, but as a person, one on whom we depend and for whom we are grateful. Let's look at what he says in John chapter 7. And we're going to look at this in 3 points. We're going to, first of all, notice my truth. Then we're going to look at his truth. And then we're going to conclude looking at our truth. So let's start with my truth. There are 2 ways to look at truth: relativism and then absolute. So let's look at those. First of all, starting with relativism. Relativism is the idea that says each individual has his or her own truth. I have my truth, you have your truth. It's different for every person. Truth is subjective. And we don't really think of relativism when it comes to building bridges that require precise measurements or treating people with medicine that requires precise treatments. We don't talk in terms of relative truth then. The only time relative truth really comes up is when we're talking about morals and ethics and what's right and wrong. That's when people start talking about their truth versus your truth, my truth, his truth. That's when relativism comes into play. The problem is, when individuals are making the rules, those rules will inevitably come into conflict with one another in a society. We don't live as islands. We share life together. And for that reason, individual truth breaks down. It just doesn't work that well. The world was confronted with this issue when the Nazis slaughtered millions of Jews in the Holocaust. And when the war was finally over in the middle of the 20th century, the Nazi Germany regime was held accountable at the trials at Nuremberg. And presiding over that was Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson. Now, the Nazis made a defense based on relativism. They said, we operated under our own laws that we have every right to make for ourselves. Just because your laws are different, that doesn't mean you can hold us accountable to your laws. We have our laws, you have your laws. That's just like saying my truth versus your truth. But they were found guilty, and the statement made by Robert Jackson was, we hold you accountable to a higher law that rises above the provincial and transient. In other words, there are individual laws, but above those must be one absolute law. And we find you guilty according to that obvious law that has been broken. Relative truth is something that's being celebrated and upheld today, but it's problematic when you consider that we live together in a society. Now, the other way to look at truth is absolute. Absolute truth says there's an objective truth that applies universally to everybody at all times. The 10 Commandments are presented as absolute truth. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery, etc. Those are rules that apply to everyone, no matter who you are or when you live. A way to look at these different views of truth is to think of the question, how many jelly beans are in a jar? Now, if you're at a contest and you're at a fair or something and they have this contest, guess how many jelly beans are in the jar. There's only one answer to that question. There's either 39 or 127. It's one or the other. There's a finite number of beans in the jar. That's objective, absolute truth. Now, if the question were, what's your favorite flavor of jelly bean? That's an example of subjective truth, relativism. It's different for every person, and that is subjective truth. The 10 Commandments are absolute truth. It's like how many jelly beans are in the jar. Your preferences and your tastes and your opinions, that's like what's your favorite flavor. Now, some people look at all truth as relative, and some people look at all truth as absolute. Jesus, when he talks about truth, he reveals what's really behind relativism when he says this in verse 18 of John chapter 7. The one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory. It's a statement about two things. It's a statement about sources, and it's a statement about motives. He talks about sources when he says, the one who speaks on his own authority. Literally, that is, the one who speaks from himself. He doesn't get his truth from heaven or from the law books or from the government, but his speaking comes from his own opinions that he has formed within. This is relativism. We all depend on sources. We draw our ideas from books, from education, from media, from parents, from other influencers in our lives, and we put all these ideas together into our truth, the tapestry of what we think of as real and right. And so truth is very much closely related to the source. Whatever your source is, that's where your truth comes from. The source of Jesus' enemies on this occasion was themselves. They were drawing their own opinions and pronouncing that as truth for everyone. It's also a statement about motives. He says, these people are seeking their own glory. So the motive was to promote themselves. It was all about their own glory. What you promote determines your truth. So what is it that you promote in your life? What is most important to you? What do you uphold? Whom do you glorify? You look at that, and that's your truth. If you are all about yourself and making yourself look good, then all your truths are going to center on your own opinions and the ways that you think things should be done. If it's about God, well, it'll be quite different from that. So let me give you a few examples of this relative truth based on coming from oneself to promote oneself. And the first example are Jesus' brothers. Look at the beginning of John chapter 7. Verse 2 says, the Jews' feast of the booths was at hand. And his brothers said, leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works that you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. And then John gives this sad footnote in verse 5, for not even his brothers believed in him. Why didn't his brothers believe in him? We know Jesus had brothers and sisters. They grew up with him. He was the oldest. They're really his half-brothers because Joseph the carpenter wasn't Jesus' biological father, but he was raised in that home with them. Did they not hear about the mysterious circumstances surrounding his birth? Did they not hear the story of when he was 12 and he got separated from his parents and they found him in the temple asking questions and answering questions with the scribes and saying, would you not know that I was about my Father's business? Did they not see that he was different from everyone else? Their judgment was clouded because the source of their truth was their own heart, and they were out to promote themselves. Not even his brothers believed. Now, after the resurrection, things changed. And you see, when Jesus ascended into heaven, among the disciples, you see his mother, his brothers, his sisters. But at this point, at the time of the Feast of the Booths, on this occasion, they didn't believe in him. The second example you have is the crowd. Look at verse 20 of John 7. The crowd answered, you have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you? Jesus said, I did one work, and you all marvel at it. Now, he's talking about the miracle John has already described in John chapter 5, where Jesus healed a man who had been a paralytic lying at the pool of Bethesda for 38 years. He'd been an invalid for a long time, and Jesus told him, take up your mat and walk, and he gets up and he walks away. 38 years of suffering ended right there with Jesus' words, but it was on the Sabbath day. So he refers to it, I did one work and you all marvel at it. Verse 22, Moses gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers, and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? He's arguing from smaller to greater. You accept a small operation on the Sabbath, but when I heal a man's whole body, then you have a problem with it. It's not reasonable. It's not rational. What was going on here is they were drawing from their own opinions, their own traditions to promote themselves. Another example of relativism. Now here's the third and last example I give, the chief priests and the Pharisees. Verse 1 tells us that they were trying to kill Jesus. They were seeking to kill him. the champions of the law were trying to kill the Messiah. And the Pharisees were so insecure, people are afraid to talk about Jesus around them for fear of repercussions, verse 13 tells us. Verse 32 tells us that they tried to arrest him, and they sent soldiers out, but the soldiers came back empty-handed, and when they asked to give an explanation as to why they didn't perform their duties that they were commanded to do, they said, "No one ever spoke like this man." And so the chief priests and Pharisees, against the will of the people and against all reason and truth and reality, were trying to kill the Messiah they were supposed to uphold. Why? Because of relativism, their own truth that they drew from themselves, because they were out to promote themselves. They saw Jesus as a threat instead of who he truly was, the Son of God. When you isolate your sources and your motives to yourself, you're going to get away from reality. You're going to have your own truth, but it's not going to be absolute truth. So that's my truth. Now let's go in the second place to his truth. Jesus' teaching was different from any teaching the people had ever heard before. Let's look at a few examples in John 7 of how different it was. Verses 14 and 15. About the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. The Jews therefore marveled, saying, "How is it that this man has learning when he has never studied?" He didn't sit at the feet of a well-known rabbi. He wasn't raised in Jerusalem. He was from Nazareth. He was a carpenter's son, yet he taught with such precision and eloquence and beauty and truthfulness that people were marveling at the words coming out of his mouth. And again, I remind you of the soldiers in verse 46 who came back empty-handed when they were sent off to arrest Jesus. Asked why they didn't perform their duties, they said, "No one ever spoke like this man." No one had ever heard a teacher like Jesus. Now remember what we said, that truth is determined by the source, where it comes from, and the motive, who you are out to promote. And what made Jesus' teaching different was the source and motive. It was from heaven and it was for God. Look at that first, looking at the source that he talked about. In verse 27, the people said, "We know where this man comes from." They were thinking about Nazareth. "We know this is a Galilean. We know he didn't come from Jerusalem. We know where this man comes from. He comes from Galilee. And when the Christ appears, no one will know where he comes from." That was their idea of the prophecies of Scripture. The Scripture says that the Messiah will just appear mysteriously out of nowhere. But we know Jesus is from Nazareth. We know his father and his mother. So Jesus proclaimed as he taught in the temple, "You know me, and you know where I come from. But I have not come of my own accord. He who sent me is true, and him you do not know. I know him, for I come from him, and he sent me." Who is he talking about there? He's talking about God. They are saying, this man is just a carpenter's son from Nazareth. And Jesus is saying, you've got it all wrong. Before Nazareth, there was heaven, and that's where I'm from. Confusion continues in verse 33. He says, "I will be with you a little longer, and then I'm going to him who sent me." They didn't have any idea what he meant. And in verse 35, they say, "Where does this man intend to go that we will not find him? Does he intend to go to the dispersion among the Greeks and teach the Greeks?" They thought maybe he was going to leave Israel and go out and do a ministry among the Gentiles. They didn't have any idea that he was talking about going to heaven. But that's where he was talking about, going to heaven, ascending into heaven after his resurrection. The debate continues in verse 41. Others said, "This is the Christ." But some said, "Is the Christ to come from Galilee? Has not the Scripture said that the Christ comes from the offspring of David and from Bethlehem, the village where David was? And there was division among the people over him." So the crowd wondered, is this the Christ? But some said, no, it can't be the Christ because of where he's from. He's from Galilee. And they're talking about prophecies in Micah chapter 5, verse 2. Prophecy says he's supposed to come from Bethlehem. Or some say, we don't know where he comes from. Bethlehem was where he was to be born, but that is different from saying where Jesus came from. Nicodemus, who had already wondered in chapter 3 of John whether Jesus was from heaven, he starts weighing in. And his colleagues on the Sanhedrin say this in verse 52, "Are you from Galilee too? Search and see that no prophet arises from Galilee." So that was the linchpin of their argument. Jesus, we know, is from Nazareth in Galilee. The Messiah was to be born in Bethlehem, or he's supposed to come from heaven. So this cannot be the Christ. Look, there's no prophet from Nazareth. No prophet from Galilee. Now, they were wrong from a couple of points of view. First of all, we know that Jonah and Nahum and even Elijah came from Galilee. So they're wrong on that. And secondly, they're also wrong because Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but before his birth, he lived in heaven. So the source of Jesus' truth was where he came from. It was from heaven, from God above. Now let's look at the motive. His source was right. What about his motive? His motive was to glorify God. Look at verses 17 and 18. "If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I'm speaking of my own authority. The one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood." Jesus repeatedly argued throughout the book of John and other places that he did not come up with the teaching on his own, but he spoke by the authority of God. That whatever the Father told him, that was what he spoke. That he wasn't trying to promote himself, but he was there to promote God in heaven. That was very different from the Pharisees, who were all about self-promotion. So when you look at Jesus' truth, it's different from everybody else's. Why? Because of the source and the motive. The source was heaven, and the motive was the glorification of God. When truth comes from heaven and seeks the glory of God, the result is something that one rarely sees. Embodiment of truth in a single life. So here's God's truth. It was embodied in one man, Jesus, as opposed to the glut of the confusing messages that are coming from the world. We get it from all sides. It's hard to know what's right and what's wrong because of all the different opinions that we're hit with. Through all that din of voices vying for our attention, we have one voice cutting through, saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Jesus, the one man, is the embodiment of truth. A consistent man, unlike the hypocrites who say one thing and live a different way. Unlike the liars who will say anything to get you to do their bidding. Unlike the manipulators who are just trying to get you to do whatever they want you to do. Unlike the constant posturing on social media that gives opinions without knowing all the facts. This man never lied, never sinned, never acted out of character with himself. He was a clear man. He wasn't confusing, trying to impress people with fancy words. Soldiers came back. Untrained people came back saying, "No one ever spoke like this man." He was one who spoke plainly to simple people, using simple illustrations, who could handle himself in debates without being misunderstood in any way, unless people were out to misunderstand him. And he was a good man. When the rich ruler came to him calling him good teacher, Jesus said to him, "No one is good except God." And he wasn't saying that he wasn't good. He was just trying to get the rich young ruler to think about what he was saying. When he called Jesus good, only God is good, he was actually saying something about who Jesus was. If only God is good, what does that mean about Jesus, who is good? It means he is the Son of God. He was the truth who sets us free. His truth is the embodiment in Jesus. One man, a consistent man, a clear man, a good man. That's what John called him, the Word, in the opening of his gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus is the reason and the explanation for all there is. He is the Son of God. He is the embodiment of truth. So when Christians insist on truth, they're not just trying to enforce this arbitrary set of laws that just was dropped in a book from heaven. What we're concentrating on is the person of Jesus Christ. That's what makes truth so important to us. So let's talk about our truth. Our truth is Jesus Christ. My truth is fine when I'm trying to decide what to have for dinner, what to listen to in my car. There's nothing wrong with personal preferences. We all have them. It's part of what makes life so rich. But when it comes to morality and ethics and right and wrong and salvation and our eternal destiny, we've got to insist on absolute truth embodied by Jesus. It's very important not to fall into relativism in those matters. Imagine you're on a desert island with 10 people, and they all have different opinions about truth. One says, it's okay if I murder people. Another one says, it's okay if I steal your possessions. Another says, promises mean nothing. Another says, violence is justified if I'm angry. How long do you think those people would survive on that island? Not very long at all. In fact, if they didn't get together on a few things and say, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not lie, you shall not turn to violence when you get angry. If they don't come to an agreement on certain things like that, they're not going to survive very long. In a society, people have to be governed by absolute truth. So what's the best candidate? Where do we turn? Let's use the source motive that we've been looking at. We said truth comes from your source and your motive. So you find the best source and motive, you find the best truth. Find judgment sourced in God, and you'll find truth. Look at John chapter 7, verse 24. Jesus said, do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. You have in there the right source. He says, don't judge by appearances. Appearances would be human sources, what we see with our eyes. God looks at things a different way. God's judgment is right because it's based in heaven. We shouldn't judge according to human sources, but God goes deep. He goes way down. When He sent He sent Samuel to the house of Jesse. Samuel saw Jesse's firstborn Eliab and thought, this is the anointed one. This is the one who's going to be the next king of Israel. And God told Samuel, do not look at him. I've rejected him. He said, God sees not as man sees. Man looks at the appearance, but God looks at the heart. God looks deeper. And so when we look at the source of truth, we ought to find truth that's sourced in God because He goes below the surface, below the appearances, down to the heart of things. He goes down deep. That's the proper source. And then we need to find truth from the motive of glorifying God. So in verse 17, this is what Jesus says. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I speak on my own authority. Your perspective determines what you believe to be true. If your attitude is, I want to please Him, then as Jesus says here, you will know the will of God. The best truth is that truth which is sourced in God and which is there to promote and glorify God, as you see in John chapter 7. And when you filter everything through this heaven-sourced, God-glorifying lens, what do you wind up with? You wind up with Jesus Christ. And so Jesus says in John 7:18, the one who seeks the glory of Him who sent Him is true, and in Him there is no falsehood. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. In a world that's drowning in opinions and conflicting ideas and philosophies of men, we have Jesus bringing us clarity, bringing us truth. Throughout John chapter 7, you see people arguing about who Jesus was. Some said He was good. Some said He was a deceiver. Some thought He might be the Christ. Some rejected Him or were seeking to kill Him. Everyone had their own version of truth. But at the Feast of Booths, there was a reminder that God's people can't live on their own terms. They lived temporary shelters to express their dependence on God, and they celebrated the harvest, expressing their gratitude for His blessings. And during a feast that was celebrating dependence on God and gratitude, you had one on whom we should depend and for whom we are deeply grateful. showing himself as the embodiment of truth. You know, I understand these questions. Why are there so many rules? And why is the church getting involved in my personal life? And why do Christians take such controversial views on ethics and morality? I understand that because a lot of people just think those are just our opinions. But that's not where it comes from. When you filter everything through the lens of heaven-sourced, God-praising, what you find is Jesus and all the commandments that we follow and all the so-called rules that we live by are based on Him. It's about a person, not a list, not a set of rules, but the one who said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. So the question isn't what feels right to me. The question is simply this: will you follow Him? Will you follow Jesus, the truth? He's calling you today. He invites you to come. He says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. And whoever opens the door, I will come in and dine with him and he with me. Fellowship with God is the purpose of life. Do you have that truth in your life? If you need some help with it, we're going to sing an invitation song to encourage you. If you need anything that we can do for you, come now as we stand together and as we sing.